hidden in a bank account in Qatar, not the U.S. Treasury, not the Federal Reserve, Qatar. We're talking about a $500 million tranche of cash from the sale of seized Venezuelan crude. According to Rubio, $300 million is accounted for, but a massive $200 million chunk is sitting in an offshore account in the Middle East. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. Reports indicate the total value of the seized oil stash could be upwards of $2 billion. Democratic senators are furious. Representative Lloyd Doggett is demanding immediate transparency. Senator Elizabeth Warren is asking the big question, is this even legal? Or have we just created an unsupervised slush fund beyond the reach of U.S. law? Why Qatar? Who controls the account? And with creditors chasing Venezuela for $170 billion in debt, is this a genius geopolitical chess move by the administration or a legal black hole waiting to collapse? Today we are diving deep. We are tracking the money, reading the transcripts, and exposing the reality behind the Qatari stash. This is the full story of the Venezuela oil billions. To understand the gravity of this situation, we have to look at exactly what happened inside the Senate Foreign Relations Committee on Wednesday, January 28, 2026. This was Marco Rubio's first testimony before the committee since the U.S. military operation that seized control of Venezuelan assets earlier this year. The hearing was ostensibly about the transition to democracy in Venezuela, but the questioning quickly pivoted to money. Here is the context. Following the U.S. seizure of Venezuelan state assets, the administration took control of approximately 50 million barrels of crude oil. At current market rates, that oil is valued at roughly $2 billion. This is the stash everyone is talking about. The administration began selling this oil on the global market to fund the new interim government in Caracas. The first sale was valued at $500 million. During the hearing, senators pressed Rubio on the whereabouts of these proceeds. That is when the secretary dropped the bombshell. He confirmed that while $300 million had been transferred to vetted Venezuelan banks to pay for basic government services like healthcare and policing, the remaining $200 million was sitting in a bank account in Qatar. Let's look at the specific exchange. When pressed on why the money wasn't in New York or Washington, Rubio stated that the fund was established in Qatar to avoid having the proceeds seized by American creditors. Rubio told the committee, "It's an account that belongs to Venezuela, but it has U.S. sanctions as a blocking mechanism. We only control the dispersal of the money. We don't control the account itself." This is a critical distinction. Rubio is arguing that the U.S. is merely a gatekeeper, but lawmakers aren't buying it. If the U.S. military seized the oil and the U.S. government arranged the sale, how can they claim they don't control the bank account where the money sits? Senator Chris Murphy pushed harder, questioning the optics of the operation. He noted, essentially, that the U.S. is taking oil at gunpoint, selling it, and then parking the cash in the Gulf. Murphy asked if this creates a precedent where the U.S. acts as a global repo man, but the most explosive reaction came from the House side. Representative Lloyd Doggett immediately issued a letter to both Secretary Rubio and Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. Doggett didn't mince words. He called the arrangement an offshore account and demanded to know what legal authorities the administration is using to act as a custodian of these funds. He explicitly asked, why did the administration not choose a country with much stronger banking laws and a history of robust management of oil revenues? This is the heart of the controversy. It's not just that the money is abroad. It's that it is in a jurisdiction that Democrats argue lacks the transparency of the U.S. Federal Reserve. So why Qatar? To understand this, we have to look at the legal nightmare that is Venezuelan sovereign debt. Venezuela owes an estimated $170 billion to international creditors. This includes bondholders on Wall Street, oil companies like ConocoPhillips and ExxonMobil who had their assets seized years ago, and other nations. If the U.S. administration had deposited that $200 million into a bank in New York, a judge could, and likely would, freeze it immediately. Creditors would file motions to garnish those funds to pay off old debts. The money would be tied up in litigation for years, making it impossible to use for the stabilization of Venezuela. Rubio's defense is that Qatar acts as a neutral location. By keeping the money outside of U.S. jurisdiction, it is theoretically safe from U.S. court orders. This isn't the first time the U.S. has used a creative banking setup for oil money. After the 2003 invasion of Iraq, the Development Fund for Iraq was set up at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. But that was under a specific UN mandate that granted immunity. Here, there is no UN mandate. The U.S. is acting unilaterally. Sources close to the administration, cited in reports by The Independent and Semaphore, claim that Qatar was chosen because it allows funds to be moved freely and safely. But this safety is exactly what worries watchdog groups. Qatar is a major financial hub, yes, but it is also outside the immediate oversight of Congress. If the money is in the U.S. Treasury, the Inspector General can audit it. If it's in the Federal Reserve, there is a paper trail. If it's in a commercial bank in Doha, who is watching the transaction ledger? Senator Elizabeth Warren has been vocal about this risk. She stated, "There is no basis in law for a president to set up an offshore account that he controls so that he can sell assets seized by the American military." Warren is probing major U.S. banks like J.P. Morgan and Citi to see if they were approached to handle these funds and refused. If U.S. banks said no because the legal risk was too high, that makes the move to Qatar look even more suspicious. Let's talk about the scale of this operation. The hearing focused on the $200 million currently sitting in the bank, but the assets seized are worth 10 times that amount. Reports indicate the U.S. holds control over 50 million barrels of Venezuelan crude. The $500 million sale was just the first tranche. That means there is potentially another $1.5 billion to $2 billion in revenue coming down the pipeline. Where will that money go? If the pilot program is this Qatari bank account, it stands to reason the rest of the billions will follow the same path. We are looking at a multi-billion-dollar shadow budget controlled effectively by the State Department and the White House, with the blocking mechanism as the only check on power. Reporter Doggett's letter raises a terrifying possibility: corruption. Venezuela's history is plagued by the looting of state assets. The oligarchs, elites who became billionaires off government contracts, siphoned billions out of the country during the Chavez and Maduro years. The Democrats are asking, what safeguards are in place to ensure this new interim government doesn't do the same thing? Rubio testified that the U.S. audits the spending. He claimed the interim leaders submit a budget every month. But without an independent auditor on the ground in Qatar or Caracas, we are essentially taking the administration's word for it. And let's not forget the political angle. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, a key figure in this arrangement, has said, "We're the bankers here. We don't direct the funds." He is trying to wash his hands of the political implications, framing it as a purely technical banking matter. But as Senator Schiff pointed out in a separate letter, there is a risk of profiteering. He is demanding to know if any senior administration officials have financial stakes in the companies handling these oil sales. Is this legal? That is the question keeping constitutional lawyers up at night. The administration is likely relying on the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA. This act gives the president broad powers to regulate commerce after declaring a national emergency. Trump declared such an emergency regarding Venezuela years ago. However, regulating commerce and seizing foreign sovereign assets, selling them, and banking the cash in a third country are two very different things. Usually seized funds are frozen, meaning they sit there untouched until a political resolution is reached. Actively selling the oil and spending the money is a proactive step that normally requires congressional appropriation. By using the Qatari account, the administration bypasses the need for Congress to appropriate funds for Venezuela. They are essentially creating a self-funding foreign policy operation. If the U.S. government can seize assets and use them to fund its preferred government in a foreign country without touching the U.S. budget, Congress loses its power of the purse. That is why senators like Warren and Doggett are sounding the alarm. It's not just about Venezuela, it's about the separation of powers in Washington. Furthermore, the custodian argument is shaky. If the U.S. decides when to release the money and who gets it, the U.S. is the de facto owner. This opens the U.S. government up to lawsuits from those creditors we mentioned earlier. If a judge rules that the U.S. government effectively owns this oil, the U.S. taxpayer could technically become liable for Venezuela's debts. While Washington argues over bank accounts, what is happening on the ground? The interim government, led by figures like Delcy Rodriguez, who flipped sides according to the hearing context, or other transitional leaders, is desperate for cash. The Venezuelan economy is broken. The oil infrastructure is rusting. Rubio argued that this money is vital for humanitarian aid. He mentioned healthcare and policing, and it is true, without cash, the transition will fail. Rubio managed expectations, telling senators, "We're not going to get there in 3 weeks." He described the situation as untenable, but trending in the right direction. However, the $200 million in Qatar is a lifeline. If the Democrats manage to freeze that account or force it into the U.S., where it gets garnished by creditors, the funding for the Venezuelan transition dries up. This puts the Democrats in a difficult position. They want oversight, but they don't want to starve the new Venezuelan government of resources. It's a high-stakes game of chicken. So, what happens next? First, watch for the response from the banks. Senator Warren gave them until January 29th, today, to respond to her inquiries. If big banks confirm they refuse this money, the scandal grows. Second, keep an eye on the House Oversight Committee. Reputer Doggett is unlikely to let this go. We may see subpoenas for the Treasury officials involved in setting up the Qatari account. And finally, the money itself. Will that $200 million stay in Doha, or will political pressure force the administration to move it? And if they move it, will the creditors pounce? Secretary Rubio spilled the beans, but he may have opened Pandora's box. The secret bank account is no longer secret, and the battle for the Venezuela billions has just begun. We will continue to track the flow of this money. If you want to stay updated on this developing story, make sure you are subscribed and have notifications turned on. What do you think? Is using a Qatari bank account a smart move to protect the money or a dangerous loophole? Let me know in the comments below.